Hi, I'm Reggie Turner. I'm here with Jim Miller and Terrence Moore. The FlipSide starts right now. Welcome to the show. Tonight we're joined by Russ and Patrick Hodge of Three Roads Communications. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's been a little while since you guys have been on the show.
It has, and we're glad to be back. It's the finality of the project.
Yes, well, for those that have been living under a rock, The House on Jonathan Street has started to air on public television, and there's going to be a premiere tomorrow night at the MLK Library in Washington, D.C. This story has went full circle. You heard of this story when you saw this project being talked about, and Terrence and I were above the fold of the Baltimore Sun. The full circle moment is you guys were above the fold on page 1 of the Baltimore Sun yesterday.
That is correct, yes. The documentary has been getting a ton of play and a ton of attention all around, and I think probably because at the end of the day, it's a really good news story. It's a story of how a community came together, kind of put a stake in the ground, fought City Hall, both literally and figuratively, and triumphed.
Excellent. Jim.
So tell me, understanding that it all started as you saw this Baltimore Sun article, tell me how this blossomed into what it's become today. Give me the history.
It was at the height of the pandemic, the summer of 2020, reading the Baltimore Sun. We were working in separate areas, Pat and I, because of the pandemic, like everybody else. I sent the article to Pat, who is my son, who also has an extensive background in archaeology, and said, am I crazy, or is there a story here? And of course, being my son, he said, yes, you are crazy, but there is a story here. And we tracked down Reggie and Terrence that day, drove up to Hagerstown from Frederick, where we're based. Pat and I had COVID hair and shorts and T-shirts, and Reggie and Terrence looked like Reggie and Terrence all the time. And we met, had coffee, talked about the project, and we realized that there was a great story here, and a story, we've all been around enough to know that there are a lot of these type of efforts where a community group gets together and tries to save something or to propose something. After talking to these two, we realized that there was a very good possibility for a number of reasons that this project would come to fruition. And so we started really at that point. We came and shot the archaeological dig, did interviews there, did as much as COVID would allow. And the more we did, the more the story uncovered itself, almost like the cabin itself. And we realized there's a hell of a story here. It's Hagerstown history is seen through the eyes of this 300-year-old cabin. And it's almost like the cabin, in a way, became a character in the story itself. So the documentary is not necessarily just Black history, it's Hagerstown history, it's American history. So.
Wow. Terrence?
It's amazing to come full circle now, almost 4 years now since we first met, and a lot has happened in that time. You gave a great summary of where we're at, but there's been a lot of learnings. There's been a lot of iterations of the documentary as well, because I think you can write a documentary on a documentary, as I've said before, because it took that amount of time and how detailed you were through that process. And more and more people started to snowball and become part of the story, which made it a story that is more alluring to the masses. I know we're in Black History Month right now, and as you said, Black history, just as, this is an example that Black history is American history, and it tells that story. Talk to me about the turn it took to really talk about the economy and manufacturing that really finds its way into the story as well.
It's interesting because Pat and I, being from different generations, we didn't necessarily disagree, but I thought that the story of the economy in Hagerstown was really a very, very large part of the story. And what's happened in Hagerstown has happened all across the country over the past 50 or 60 years or so. And I thought it was very important in these times where everybody's saying, why can't people agree, to tell this story and use Hagerstown. It's interesting. In the documentary, we use Hagerstown as kind of a stand-in or a metaphor, not to sound too film schoolish about it, but as a metaphor for what's happened in a lot of towns and cities across America. And then what we also realized is what happened here affected things nationally. So there's a lot of back and forth. For instance, we covered the topic of redlining, and we talk about redlining on a national scale, but then we say, okay, here's how it affected Hagerstown, here's how it affected Jonathan Street. Because if it affected Hagerstown, it affected hundreds of other towns and cities across America. If it affected Jonathan Street, then it affected Jonathan Street in every town and city across America.
And just like how Black history is American history, economic history is also American history, and the deindustrialization of the United States, especially along the Rust Belt, has been incredibly impactful to the United States history. Plus, it's just really the Moeller factory, the unions that were in town, the Fairchild, its role in World War II. Economic history has a role to play in military history. It has a role to play in civil, social history. It's all history is connected, but I think economic history we really found was kind of the through line of this documentary.
And one of the things that's really interesting too, you come to realize that Hagerstown character is defined, much the way it was in Pittsburgh or Chicago or Baltimore, by the fact that these were a bunch of tough people who worked in tough jobs and made a good living and could support their family. And when that was taken away, that's not only a big problem economically, but it's also a big problem psychologically, emotionally, and not to get all touchy-feely about it, but if you define yourself as somebody who provides for your family and works your butt off and works in a really difficult job where you're exhausted at the end of the night, and then that's taken away from you, and you can no longer provide for your family or can't provide for your family the way your father did when those jobs were available, then that's a source of a lot of anger and frustration. So the economic angle really impacts everybody's life. I mean, this is America. It's the American dream. Everybody wants to do better. Everybody wants their kids to do better. And if that rug is pulled out from under you, that's a big deal. Not just economically, but socially, emotionally, and in terms of self-identity too.
For our viewers that may not be familiar with the term, talk about redlining. What are you saying there?
Well, we have one of our resident experts. Redlining is one of those things I think, at least for me, I thought I knew what it was until I did this documentary. And one of our challenges in doing the documentary is we had to fit 300 years of history into about 58 minutes. But we thought it was really important to spend about 2 minutes on the idea or the concept or the reality of what redlining is. And redlining is a tool. In the documentary, we actually cut back and forth between a lawyer who was a MacArthur Genius Award winner.
Terrence W. Mitchell.
Yes, exactly. And Terrence, who was just not quite exactly on the same level. But Dr. Mitchell would explain redlining on a macro level, and it took place everywhere. It wasn't just Hagerstown. It took place in New York. It took place in every place that you would think are liberal bastions. And then Terrence explained how it happened and what the impact was on Jonathan Street. So we cut back and forth so that people got a real idea of, okay, here's the concept, but then here's how it affected real people in this neighborhood, on this block that you have grown to care about through this documentary. So,
And it's not just historically, it's present day
Yes.
impacts that are still being felt is also communicated. So it's not just, you're watching a documentary just on history, you're watching a documentary of watching history kind of repeat itself and the residual effects of things that happened historically as well. So you're kind of sitting in the middle of the documentary and learning as kind of time catches up with you and moves you forward to some of the things that are happening. And redlining is one of those things that still happens. And I know a critical point of that story is Jonathan Street with redlining was pretty much that there were areas of the community that were told not to lend to. So financial institutions were told, and literally there were maps that were given out by our federal government, across the country that really drew red lines around certain communities and named them high risk. And those communities were predominantly people of color. And by not lending, you took away one of the greatest tools for building equity and wealth in this country and being able to purchase and buy real estate, as well as to maintain and keep up your real estate as we deal with vacancies in some of these communities still today. And we see some of these homes that are called blighted properties, but a lot of that comes from not having access to capital, which is residually comes from being redlined for decades and, over time. So those are the kind of things, and even like Jonathan Street, to the point where certain streets were named accordingly, so people knew which streets not to go down and which ones not to lend to. And we've heard the story, even when I came here from New York, was don't go down Jonathan Street, right? So that's something that's residual of that mentality of redlining, because the African-American community starts at Jonathan Street, but after that turns to Summit Avenue. And at the same time, we watch a community that is struggling in a cabin, but at the same time, on the other side of Summit Street, we have a multi-million-dollar stadium going up at the same time. So you can see some of that comparisons that are still impacting us today, and how do we mend those relationships and do some of that healing and creating some kind of equity in our communities. So that's a lot of the story in redlining that kind of summed up. That's in the documentary.
One of the interesting things is, too, at a certain point, I think it was in the early 30s, there was no Summit Avenue. Jonathan Street was Jonathan Street all the way through. And in order to delineate between where you wanted to put money and where you didn't, that became Summit Avenue.
Right.
So it was a very calculated idea on how to kind of redline. And one of the things that was very interesting to me, I understood redlining in a kind of a large concept. I didn't realize that meant you couldn't borrow money to put a new roof on your house or to fix the porch that was falling down. It all became a self-fulfilling prophecy where it led to a spiral and a cycle of decline.
And a lot of the times when you could get a loan, it wasn't from an actual bank lender. It was from some predatory lender who was basically, the whole idea is either they're going to end up getting your property from you because you can't pay off the mortgage, or they're just going to get an incredible amount of money from you as it goes along. So a lot of it was very predatory lending that was the only capital that a lot of people could access in redline communities. And so that sort of then creates a lot of the self-fulfilling prophecy and stuff like that. So a lot of it is the fact that a lot of the mortgages were not guaranteed by the federal government and stuff like that, which pretty much made it so a lot of the banks could learn, okay, this is an area that's lower quality, so we're going to give less mortgage, higher interest rates, or just no lending to this area, and we're only going to focus on the green or yellow areas. And that's sort of what redlining, you can see that the maps that they have from Boston, New York City, where they literally have red areas that do not lend to this area versus green areas, which are a lot more more easier to lend to.
One of the interesting things that we found in this too, which I didn't realize, my generation and probably yours, Jim, to a certain extent, almost everybody's parents bought their first house with a VA mortgage, which required almost no money down, and also was low interest rate. And in the law authorizing VA benefits, it was deliberately written in there that was not applicable to African American veterans. So the guys and the women who went to World War II and fought and may have gotten killed or their leg shot off or PTSD or whatever it was, didn't have the same benefits as, say, my father or all the other fathers in the neighborhood where I grew up in. So they couldn't get that first rung on the ladder when they came back from the war. And, the suburbs boomed after World War II, which we show in the documentary. There were places like Levittown in New York, which was the first suburb, or Levittown outside of Philadelphia, where everybody bought their house with $50 down and a low interest mortgage. African Americans couldn't do that. So again, back to the idea that, you pay your mortgage for 30 years, you own the house outright, you get to pass it on to your kids, and that's how you build generational wealth. That was denied to the people who had gone to war and could have been killed or maimed or anything else. And it's interesting when we screen the documentary, and it's largely been almost completely white audiences that we've screened it with, that seems to impact their view of things more than almost anything else, because I don't think most people are aware of that. I know I certainly wasn't before we started working on the documentary.
We don't often see policy in our history books, right? And these were policies that were put in place that impacted us and segregated us to a point, and segregated our wealth. And we just heard the governor talk about it just yesterday, talk about what the wealth gap looks like. But this documentary also is not a story of victimhood either, right? And in no way belittling the communities and that are even Hagerstown and Washington County has talked about, but it's one of resiliency. As difficult as redlining was, this is the same community that came straight out of slavery with nothing and started reconstruction period and opened schools and established businesses in that same community. With 50 plus businesses were right in that community concentrated alone. So it was some ebbs and flows of policies that came into play that really impacted that community. And every time there was a point of resiliency where they kind of snap back, push forward. And I think when we start talking about the cabin in this, we see that we could be on the precipice of this community as a whole, not just the Jonathan Street community, but Hagerstown and Washington County on the precipice of doing that once again. Right, so it is a story of here's the opportunity. There's no better time than now. This is what you've learned from your past. These are the opportunities for you to push forward and change some of that narrative, and which, of course, requires some great and strong leadership, because there's some challenges to doing that.
Right. And on the point that Terrence was making in regards to this is not a victimhood story, two of the oldest standing institutions in the Jonathan Street community are now receiving investment. We've talked a lot about the Robert W. Johnson Community Center and the investment that it's receiving. The community center received an additional $150,000 from the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And a block away, you have American Hall, which is another one of the oldest standing institutions on Bethel that has been in desperate need of repair, that is receiving $250,000. So, that's the good side of that. But Russ, there's a lot of other topics I want to jump into, and I want to come back and start with talking about how you put 300 years of history in 57 minutes, the amount of
That's the gray
interviews
hair.
that didn't make it, and the treasure trove of information that you've been able to receive. So think about that for a moment, and we'll come back and talk about that. All right. All right, stay with us. We'll have more of the flip side after the break. Welcome back to the show. We're still joined by Russ and Patrick Hodge of Three Rose Communications talking about the upcoming documentary, The House on Jonathan Street. Russ, just to come back to you, 300 years of history in 57 minutes, there's a lot that hit the cutting room floor.
There is, yeah. If you notice in the documentary, we managed to pretty much glance over the entire World War I era, just because there's not enough time. Our first cut came in at almost an hour and a half, and we had 58 minutes to fill in the documentary. So it's packed full of information. It's something that you probably will watch 2 or 3 times to get something different or something more out of it every time you do. So about 10 terabytes worth of footage and interviews.
Yeah, about 40 different interviews that we did with wide range of people, from historians to local community members to politicians to policymakers to just a huge range of people. And it's just, that's all pretty much, the interviews themselves are just fantastic oral histories of Hagerstown, of Washington County. So that itself is just really important information.
There was a lot of very interesting stuff too. I mean, we interviewed, I think, 15, 16 members, residents or former residents of the Jonathan Street community, all of whom their remembrances of not only Jonathan Street, but the way things were in Hagerstown. And it's very fascinating because we talked to Governor Moore and Senator Van Hollen, Congressman Trone, and you get the policy perspective. But when you talk to the residents of the town, you get the human perspective on here's what they've done or here's how life was there. And you get a great picture of the community, and you get a great picture of the entire Hagerstown community as well. And as Pat said, it is a treasure trove of information and of oral histories that really, as people look back 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, it's that first person witness to history stuff that's so illuminating, because again, history is not dates necessarily, it's stories about human beings, and that's what comes through.
And there were unfortunately, because it was an hour and a half long and we had to cut out probably about 30 minutes, we had to pretty much cut out chunks too. So there are really interesting whole chunks that we think are documentary worth that unfortunately just couldn't make it into it. And one of them, for instance, is the annexation of parts of the city's annexation or lack of annexation of parts of the actual county. And it's really fascinating, it's really important, but the problem is that we just didn't have that much footage to show for it, and it was just too long of a thing, and it wasn't one of the more impactful pieces of history, even if it was really important. So that's one of the things that you could probably really get watching the interviews back and stuff like that too with the treasure trove.
One of the things that's really interesting about this, or one of our big challenges, is this program is distributed nationally. As of this morning, we have 195 broadcasts slated, including in 19 of the top 20 markets, all of the top 10 markets, the New Yorks and LAs and Chicagos and Phillies and every place else. So for those people, most of whom have never heard of Hagerstown, we had to place Hagerstown into a context for them. So we had to explain what it was economically, socially, politically, very quickly. But we also then decided, particularly with the annexation story, that it is really important to the Hagerstown story, but unfortunately it probably wasn't of that much interest to people outside of Hagerstown because it wasn't necessarily representative of what went on in their communities. So that was one of the things that we wound up jettisoning. But again, if you're talking about economic history and the fact that the city does not derive taxes and revenue and has not for 50 or 60 years from all the development that has gone outside in the county, then that is something that is impactful to Hagerstown and has, hurt in a lot of ways probably as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of that sort of stuff too. Again, this is not the be-all to end-all history of Hagerstown, but what it is a very good way for people to understand what's gone on here, what the cabin has seen, the history of Hagerstown as representative of the entire United States, and where it's going from here, and what the cabin's revitalization, rehabilitation, whatever the correct word may be, what impact that has on this town and what the lesson might be for other towns and communities across America.
And there's just so much information. We did have to get rid of a bit, but there's still so much information in there that like a lot of people they've watched it a couple times now and they'll go back, oh, I didn't see that the first time,
Right.
sort of a
Yes,
thing.
yeah.
And so there's a lot of that. And I think that's sort of the main thing that we wanted to do because there's so much information here. It's almost like a primary source of here's the oral histories of this, here's the oral histories of this, which means that people can almost go in and do their own research, and then there could be documentaries out of just a small segment out of what we kind of talk about. As Terrence pointed out before, there were like the John Brown's farm that turned into a James Brown concert venue. That itself could be its own documentary. It's just an incredible story, and it has enough there that it could be flushed out into
Something very interesting with that too, we played clips about a week or so ago at Emerald Point, and the audience there, affluent, all white, not one of those people knew about John Brown's farm as a concert venue. And some of them said, oh, this is all the music we used to dance to, but they didn't know that went on. So even within the Hagerstown community itself, I think there'll be a lot of illuminating things in the documentary that they didn't necessarily know of beforehand.
Yeah. Now, as of the airing of this show, the first screenings were on WHUT, which is Howard University Television. I've received feedback from people that I've known from the community, and the first thing that I heard is I've been here all my life and I didn't know this. Mm-hmm. So for many, this is a history lesson about the world that you grew up in, but from a context that you didn't know, and I think that's powerful. Another gentleman responded on my Facebook page was kind of after the generation that was not able to take advantage of the VA mortgage, and he says, I was.
Yeah.
Right? But that's been the difference in his ability to build wealth
Yes.
and do things of that nature. But I think the amazing thing about the documentary is that there's something in it for everyone. For the folks that are coming in for this old house,
Yes, yeah.
right? It may not be as much in it for those folks, right? If they're just looking for just the rehabilitation of the home. But there's a little bit in there, and there's
It's
some
not flip and
context.
flop. It's not Chip and Joanna
Right.
Gaines. Right. No,
Right.
It's not that. No.
But there's a little bit in it for everyone, and I think the exciting thing for our community and beyond, this is going to be an educational tool. And there's so many projects and studies and things that can just come off of this 1 hour.
Yes. Yeah.
Have you considered what to do with the treasure trove of information that you still have?
I think the short answer is no.
Before
but
you answer that, I did get a call right before we came and started aired the show where a school teacher wanted to said, how can I get my hands on this? I want to turn it into curriculum
Yes.
for her school. So I don't think there is a one answer. You may have one that you may preference, but I think there's so many different ways this documentary can be used.
And I think that's true. And again, well, there are a number of things. For instance, educationally, already there is the largest educational distributor in the country has already bought the rights to this, so it'll be distributed to schools and to libraries all around the country. So it will be available at some point, probably even for streaming for everybody with a library card. I just don't know. I have to be honest with you, and Reggie has asked me a couple times, has this lived up to your expectations? And I said to him today, yes, it has lived up to its expectations in terms of the number of broadcasts and the impact and the corollary stories and everything else, although I always have very high expectations. And I wouldn't be surprised if this does not have a life outside of just the public television broadcasting. To be honest, this program was not even available to PBS stations until Saturday of this past week. And sight unseen, 195 broadcasts signed up for it, including a bunch of prime time. I mean, Los Angeles coming up as a prime time airing. Now, Los Angeles is one of the top 3 television markets in America. People would pay a fortune to have an hour-long program about their community with the PBS demographic, on a PBS station in Los Angeles. A lot of other places, Orlando, Tulsa, the home of the Tulsa Massacre, has it on in prime time. This is really, I think, in a way, the gift that's going to keep on giving.
Right.
Not only for Hagerstown, but the country itself. Again, we don't take any sides on anything. It's, for those old enough to remember Dragnet and Jack Webb and Just the Facts, ma'am, this is just the facts. And it's not swayed. It's not meant to make anybody feel bad. It's not made I think some people will feel badly about stuff. It's not made to make anybody feel guilty. It's just that Americans love history, and this is history. And again, I'll go back and say it. It's not black history. It's not white history. It's history. And the things that have impacted Hagerstown have impacted white people and black people and Latino people and Asian people. And there's something to be learned from this. And the thing we got out of it is common humanity. People have a lot of the same problems. We're all in this together. We need to be open to change. I mean, there are a million different lessons that you might be able to take from this. But unless you know the stories, you're not able to analyze it and come to your own conclusions then.
One of the big events that was on the chopping block that didn't make it other than kind of B-roll footage is the ribbon cutting of the cabin. A lot of that didn't make it. Talk a little bit about that. Like, what's your perspective of that event, like that moment in time where the streets are blocked off and you have, over 100 people or so that are in the community for this event? Tell me a little bit about your recollections of that.
I think the first thing that pops to my mind is how we were filming that and everything was so energetic and everyone was loving it, but I remember talking to one of the community members and he was on his porch just looking at everything, pretty much saying, this is all really wonderful, but what's going to happen after this? Is there going to be, is this the momentum going to keep going? Basically was what he was saying. Is this just people coming for a photo op and not continuing on?
Right.
Basically was what he was saying. And that really kind of struck me because I was there also taking photos, but I really really made me think, is this going to actually be a catalyst? Is this actually going to be something that really tries to transform the community a little bit? And I think that a lot of the community kind of getting together, the speeches, I think it did sort of give that signal of, there's at least like that fight that was still there. There's that that spirit that still wanted to get that was going to change. Basically, it felt like there was a lot of strength there. Basically, is what I'm trying to say.
I would say it was inclusion.
Yeah.
I think it was a point of inclusion because I think you've seen people on that street from every different walk of life. You've seen people from different industries. And, you know, one of the things, I said up there was, you know, if this is your first time, may it not be your last time walking down the streets of Jonathan Street. But I think it was that whole part of all the stuff that was going on downtown that everyone was hearing about, the investments. Jonathan Street is downtown. And I think that was one of those times where you felt that feeling of inclusion, like, okay, we're part of this change.
Right.
You know, downtown is changing, and we're included in that change as well. So that's one of the things that resonated from that. And I'll kind of pitch a little question over to Jim, because I know that we were really close to this, and I think sometimes too close and passionate to the story as you were building the documentary and as we were doing some of the work. I know you have a huge circle of influence over your time, and guess on the flip side, outside of your personal life. Have you heard about some of the things that were going on in the documentary, or have you been hearing?
Well, I've heard now that it's out, I have heard several people who were not involved who now all of a sudden want to come in and take credit. Sorry, just a fact. I've heard,
Would you care to give us any names,
not on the show.
initials?
I've heard people that are very interested in seeing it who have not seen it yet. And of course, you know, it's just now available, and so there's a lot of time for them. But they saw the preview, but they're very interested in it. I've heard people stating exactly what the person on the porch said. Okay, what's next?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the key. I mean, this is going to be a blip for the politicians. At the end of the day, in my opinion, this is not going to be a long-term thing for them. This is going to be a blip. Look what we did. Aren't we great? Push the button for us next time. But long-term, I don't know.
And that's a very, very good point. One of the things that I know I'm personally heartened by, because I look at real estate listings all the time, is that the housing prices on Jonathan Street seem to have gone up at least as much as they have in the rest of Hagerstown over the past couple years, and probably more. So the property values are climbing, which will probably lead to more investment, probably easier able to get loans to fix up your places. So, you know, we think about that guy on the porch a lot, and we talk about that, and I think he had a very valid point, because as you say, the politicians love to come in and cut the ribbon, and then you never see them again. It seems like this has taken on a momentum of its own now, and I think one of the really interesting things is if they can do this on Jonathan Street, and Jonathan Street really is rebounding, then it can be done in all of Hagerstown. So it really is like the little log cabin that could. And I think psychologically, it's so good for the community and Hagerstown to be able to say, you know, we turned this around, and we're able to turn this around for the community, for the entire Hagerstown community as a whole.
Well, and I think that is, in my mind, what incentive does this provide to the residents to really take that extra time to fix up their yard or do whatever the case may be to make the community better? What incentive does it provide for people outside of our community that are seeing this, that say, wow, this is a community that I should invest in?
It's a great question, and I think the answer to that is this documentary shows how Jonathan Street was prosperous.
Right.
There were a lot of smart entrepreneurs who lived on Jonathan Street. One of the things I didn't realize is in many of these communities, you go out to work during the day, and even though there were not sundown laws in Hagerstown, effectively they were. You came back, you spent the money in the community. So a lot of businesses that popped up. So there was economic viability there. There was social mobility there. Everybody was very much involved in the North Street School and making sure the kids got a good education because they knew that was their ticket out. And I think knowing that at one point it was a very strong, viable community leads people to believe that it can happen again too. It wasn't just a blip in time.
The other question is, and we if you would have heard a city council meeting probably 6 months ago now, we had residents from a certain portion of that community talking about some of the drug problems and the fact that, there's things going on that shouldn't be going on. And it would seem to me, and I may be totally wrong about this, but if we start building the good things in that community, I think those people, they don't want to be in somewhere, they don't want to be somewhere
Where
where
the spotlight is.
that's exactly right.
Right.
And that could help without, and we still need police presence. We still need all of the things we have today, but that could help get rid of some of that element to whatever degree it exists.
I would add that, maybe 2 years ago now, about a year and a half ago, as we were wrapping up the cabin renovation, Chief Kiefer came out and gave a statistic about amount of crime that had went down in the Jonathan Street area during that window of time when the lights were on and people came out and were invested and interested in the community from across the entire city and county. And that was a direct reflection of feeling heard, feeling understood, feeling included. So I think, Jim, I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I think this adds to that, not just for Jonathan Street, but for Hagerstown and Washington County as a whole. How many times have we come on the show and talking about the investment in Hagerstown or Washington County because we're net takers? Well, you come a net taker because you haven't been initially invested in up front, so you become a net taker. So, and I think as far as politicians taking a victory lap, I think it's going to be hard in this documentary because they are holding themselves accountable by agreeing to the issues and saying that they are aware of it and at times how they contributed to it in their administrations and how they're just learning about some of these things, which gives constituents an opportunity to hold them accountable for, all right, now that you recognize it, now that you acknowledge it, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, and I think, with a new election cycle, this gives a great opportunity for candidates to dig in and to kind of create a platform in regards to, the different things that you would like to do. But and coming back, Jim, I want to answer your question when we come back in regards to and what you were posing in regards to what's next and what we've learned through this process. I'll tease that, but we'll come back and talk about that. Stay with us. We'll have more with Three Roads Communication after the break. Welcome back to the show. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. But picking right up where we left off in regards to kind of what's next and will this sustain, that was really on our minds from the beginning. We didn't look at the cabin as an end-all, be-all, because the cabin was really only going to have a direct impact on one family that purchased it. Now, it is having an impact on investment in regards to homes and property values, and that's what we looked at as well, because when you look at the wealth gap between African Americans and whites, the biggest piece of the wealth gap for middle-class Americans is home ownership. And in that community, one of the things that was important is that when the elders in that community that own homes, and it's only about 14%, when they do pass away, we would like for there to be an asset that's left as opposed to a liability. Because many of the deteriorating homes, the next generation assumes them and it's a burden and you have to pay taxes and then they fall into disrepair and a lot of other things, and then all of a sudden there's a notice where they want to demolish it and we don't know if it's a historic home or not. So that's just been a perpetual cycle. But the humbling part, though, is in regards to building organization and community. After Professor Lynn Bowman wrote her book, 10 Weeks on Jonathan Street, it was humbling for Terrence and I to find out, like, building organization like the Western Maryland CDC was nothing new. This community was doing this in the late 1800s. Jacob Wheaton was pretty much a part of every movement there was and every organization there was to build community development organizations that, whether it was supporting families that were downtrodden or not able to pay for funerals and medical bills, real estate, those things were being done since then. So what we found was when you understand your history, the rich history of where you come from, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can look back to what the ancestors did to break through, and you can go right back to that blueprint, but using today's modern times and technology and advances to move the project forward. And that was just amazing to me, for us to kind of recognize that, we're following in the footsteps of the ancestors of the community.
And again, I think the psychological impact of this stuff is so important. We are producing a documentary now about Frederick, and probably most people don't realize that back in the 70s, Frederick was in much the same shape that Hagerstown had been. A lot of the stores in downtown Frederick moved out to the malls, to the suburbs, and then there were 2 devastating floods. So Frederick, basically, nobody could get insurance, none of the businesses, and they were faced with a lot of different problems that they had to solve in order to restore the downtown and to have it, get rehabilitated. And a lot of what they did was psychological. They made sure everybody kept all their buildings in good shape and painted. They went and literally recruited restaurants to come to downtown. There was a lot of legwork, a lot of elbow grease that went into turning things around there, and it's a million different things. It's not just one, it's not a stadium. It's not something else that is the be-all to end-all that changes everything. It's a whole bunch of positive change where people start feeling better about things, and they stop feeling so damn afraid of everything. Sorry if you have to cut that. And they realize that they can move forward, and as you say, they realize that it had been prosperous at one point, and that it is attainable. It's not something that can never happen again. So much of this is psychological. I think at the end of the day, that may be the biggest impact for that cabin, is that this tiny little cabin has had such impact on that community and on the city.
I think it's a major part, but we got to be clear that well wishes and positive energy never gets much done, right? There has to be about moving
Pressure.
with intention, right? There has to be strategic decisions being made. You can't just open things up and say, if we build it, they will come, right? You have to be thinking 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ahead and planning for everything that may happen in between, and being positive when rough times come, but understanding that you have a plan forward and being able to adapt. So I think it's the parallel of keeping positive through those changes and not, coming out with the pitchforks as soon as something doesn't go right in the community, but understanding that change is difficult. You're never going to get it exactly right, but at least if you can convey a plan and strategically, put those steps forward where people know where the end goal is and see that momentum, I think that's where some of the benefit comes. And I think that's some of the things that Frederick did that worked in their favor.
And not to be scared, and if there's something that knocks you back 2 steps when you've only taken 1 step forward, get up off the ground, fight forward again.
And I think the key to all of that is the focus on little successes. The successes build on success,
Right.
and people want to follow success. And if you can do something like save a log cabin from being demolished, then that can be built upon, and there can be more success coming from that. One of the biggest lessons from Frederick is the focus on just planting trees around downtown,
Right.
which is a very, very small thing, but they were successful in it, and it built, and there was the plan, as you're saying, there was their idea, they want to get more greenery, we want to make it look nicer, but they weren't trying to go for a giant plan of remodeling the entire downtown. It was, let's add this trees, let's bury the power lines, which, to be fair, is a pretty big thing, burying power lines. But there are a lot of other very small things that then led up to the burying of the power lines. So I think a lot of it is getting these small successes that kind of build upon each other a little bit.
And there's going to need to be a shift, because 99% of the financial support for the projects in this community is coming from the state. The city and the county, there's been a missed opportunity over these last 4 years to step up to be a larger presence. And I think this documentary gives another launch point to step forward and be a part of the growth. Because one clip that hit the cutting room floor that I really wish was in the documentary, there was one politician that said, you cannot have a robust Hagerstown without a robust Jonathan Street.
That is correct, former Mayor Brucci.
Yeah.
Yep. And he said there's not one area of the town that can be in bad shape and the town can prosper.
Right.
It's incompatible. And that, you're right, that was That's a perfect example of some of the stuff that we had to take out just because there wasn't room of it. But it was a great point that he made, yeah.
Yeah, because a rising tide should lift all ships. Right. And I just want to add this too here, that just something else to think about is, from a business standpoint, it costs more to recruit a customer than it is to take care of the customers that you already have, your existing customers. And I think that plays the same way when you start thinking about communities and counties and cities as well. I know it's a great idea to be recruiting wealth and high dollar tax dollars to come into your community, but you should be equally, if not more, spending those dollars internally because the return is so much greater. So there's so many opportunities, and we talk about home ownership. We're at it right now where just money in a savings account is yielding almost 5% interest APY over a year time frame. If you're able to take equity out of your home and just sit it in a savings account, in most cases, you're bringing home more money if your interest rate was prior to the 7% rates that we're seeing right now. But at rates at 3-4% that we've seen for almost 2 decades, you can be making more money than you're paying in interest on your own mortgage right now. But these are wealth generating opportunities and financial opportunities that, one, most people aren't aware of, and two, most people don't have access to capital to do it because their homes don't have the equity in. So just wanted to point that out as we talk about investing in some of the lessons that can be pulled out of this documentary.
This can be a catalyst, but it also has to be an ongoing effort by everyone, not just the city, not just the county, not just the state, not just the residents, everyone.
Right.
Because we know
We need the business community as well.
absolutely. We
need
know
the
we need
nonprofit community.
we don't just need a big bang. We need frequency. We need
Yes.
continued things. And I like what you said, and I agree with you 100%. There's a concept in organizational change management that's called +1, and it essentially says 2 things. Number one, you don't try to do the whole thing at once.
Right.
You break it into a small part, and when you reach trouble, you take that small part and you pare it down to something so small that there's no way you can fail at it. And if you do that, you're guaranteed a success. You may not get it may be several more steps to get to the success you want, but that's okay. It's about moving forward.
Agile.
It is, and one of the interesting things in doing this documentary, there were a number of people in town and in the county who were very, very supportive. But there were also a number of people who were not, who I think either did not want to see the documentary succeed or didn't quite get it. And I think part of that is born from a mentality where they're afraid to get their hopes up. They're afraid to feel too good about something. And I think the fact that even this documentary got done kind of against a lot of odds is also something that shows that good things can happen and that you don't need to be negative and cynical about everything all the time too. And again, the success building upon the success. I'll go back to it. You started out with the story in the Baltimore Sun this week, Above the Fold, the picture of Terrence obscuring me. and you know what? When was the last time Hagerstown was above the fold on the front page of the Baltimore Sun?
Well,
where it didn't
include the cabin.
That's
right. And I don't know. I mean, the last time I remember the Baltimore Sun, and I don't know if it was a Sunday paper, but it was a scathing article
About
all the problems.
Right.
Little Baltimore. That little
I guess
little
that was,
Baltimore.
Yep.
That was what, 2016-ish, I mean
Yes.
that. And, sometimes when you read the comments from outside of this community and how they characterize this community that haven't seen the documentary, but they see the promotion of it, you can tell that a lot of these stigmas and stereotypes exist. One of the things in going through Leadership Maryland, when the classes come to different communities, it's one of the things that you do when they come to your community is you're dispelling some of the myths and notions of what they come in, preconceived notions about your community. And I heard this when I was in Baltimore Monday at my Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture meeting. Someone said, like Hagerstown's known for their prisons. Like that's what they associate. And even with, we've talked about this with Leadership Maryland, like when they come here, one of the things that they do, there's a visit to the prisons. And, as a board member, that's something that I would like for us to get away from because there's so much more to offer in this community. And I think this documentary goes a long way towards widening the breadth of what is here, but not only what is here and what has happened, but also the opportunity ahead and framing a new story.
And I'd be remiss as a TV producer not to mention that on February 18th at 3 p.m. at the Maryland Theater, downtown Hagerstown, there will be a free screening. You don't have to register. You do not have to purchase tickets. Show up, and we will show the documentary at 3 o'clock. Lots of people are interested right now. It is kind of our collective gift to the community for having kind of put up with us running around shooting. And frankly, thank you to the Convention and Visitors Bureau that not only supported the production of the documentary, along with Mary Bowman Foundation and a bunch of Heart of the Civil War. Thank you, the Washington Arts Council. But thank you, Convention and Visitors Bureau, because they're underwriting the screening at the Maryland Theater as well. So for any of you whose interest is piqued by this discussion today or what's actually in there, 3 o'clock on February 18th.
February 18th, Maryland Theater.
We've got about 2 minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, don't give up. Documentary shows. This is the little log cabin that can. It's a metaphor for the street. It's a metaphor for Hagerstown. It's a metaphor for any other town that's been kicked around by circumstances that in many cases are beyond their control. You know, it's the same advice that I gave my kids. You're going to get knocked down, get up, fight again, fight again. And if you continue not to give up, and if you continue to believe, you can change your fortunes.
Sir Winston Churchill, one of my favorite quotes of his, when you're going through hell,
Keep going.
keep going.
And that is the only time I'm ever going to be compared to Winston.
Well, Russ and Pat, I want to thank you guys. I want to thank you for coming to Hagerstown at a time when the world was about to shut down in 2020 to talk about this. Terrence and I really appreciate you not giving us COVID on that visit, and your vision, because at that time we had no clue where this was going. We knew we had a mission. It was God-led, so we just had to just stay obedient to that mission. But what's coming out of this for the community is exciting. And, you know, there are a lot of other projects in the works, but like you said, Jim, it's all hands on deck. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That is all the time that we have for tonight. We hope that you'll like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and send us your comments to feedback@theflipsidetv.com. That is feedback@theflipsidetv.com. But most importantly, join us again next week for another episode of Flipside.